Hello, friends. Welcome to the Living Truth Podcast. Kristin Carey hosting today, and I'm very honored to have as our guest today Molly LaCroix. Molly, thank you so much for being with me on the Living Truth Podcast today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I'm so glad to connect with you.
Yeah. You guys, I've read uh, Molly's two books, and they have made a huge impact on me. Molly is a licensed marriage and family therapist. She specializes in the impact of trauma and adversity. And she particularly uses a modality of therapy called internal family systems that really helps people heal from trauma and experience abundant life. I have been doing internal family systems therapy with a therapist and my husband too for 2.5 years. So if you've listened to our podcast for any length of time, you've heard us talk about it. And I've never had a guest who's like honing in on this idea of multiplicity in each of us as human beings. So, Molly, can you explain this view of our multiplicity through the internal family systems lens?
I'd love to. And I'll start with sort of an ideal system. Now, we know that all of us as humans come into this world. We're not blank slates. We carry the legacy of our ancestry in our genes, etc. But let's just think of the ideal system for a moment. In the ideal human system that God created, we bear God's image. And in IFS, for lack of a better term, we simply call that self. Because as Dr. Richard Schwartz, who developed the model, was curious with clients and would help them heal varying things, then these qualities would emerge, like compassion and curiosity, the ability to connect, to be calm, all these lovely qualities. And he'd say, well, what part of you is that? And they'd say, well, that's just myself. And so this core of us, our soul is another, we might want to call it, but this undamaged core that reflects God's image and possesses God-given resources is an essential aspect of who we are from the beginning. We also have various parts of ourselves. So that's the multiplicity you refer to, that beyond just this core, there are different parts of us that we can think of as our characteristics, our talents, our traits. If you've ever done a personality typology like the Enneagram or Strength Finders or myriad others, those all identify these different facets of who we are. And in an ideal world, we just have the richness that comes from that diversity of multiple facets of ourselves that we bring to the world as the unique creature that God created. So that's the ideal. But life happens,
Yeah.
sometimes beginning in the womb, sometimes as a legacy of our ancestry. And there's an impact on that system. And I often will use the term adversity versus trauma to talk about the impact because not everything rises to the technical definition of trauma. And also, it's highly subjective as in terms of each individual, whether an external event is traumatic or adverse or no big deal at all. But adversity is a pretty broad term that I will typically use. So something adverse happens. Let's say this child is born and a parent is mentally ill and unavailable to the child, or born into poverty and there's a lack of nutrition. There's a lack of time because the parents are working 2 and 3 jobs. There's some kind of a lack. That's an adverse event for that little baby system.
Mhm.
And the system, one of the other God-given beautiful resources that we have as humans is the ability to adapt. And so the system has this wound, and immediately the system begins to adapt to whatever that nature of that wound was. And in IFS, we talk about parts of us who take on adaptive strategies, and we call them protectors because they want to protect the system from the risk that is inherent in wounds. When we think of a physical wound, We know we're more vulnerable when we have a physical illness of whatever kind. And our systems are afraid of vulnerability. Vulnerability is a threat to our well-being. And so protective parts of us take on some kind of a job to keep that vulnerability at bay, to what we call in IFS terms, to exile it. So in our internal system, I've now identified three different things. The core self, we can think of as self or soul. I've identified that we have wounded members of our internal family we call exiles. They must be exiled because they're a threat to our well-being. And then we have our dedicated team of protectors, and they are on a mission to either proactively avoid the threat of an exile's pain surfacing. So we call them managers. It's a category of protector. They're trying to manage and control everything they can possibly manage or control, from our appearance to the way we speak, the way we show up, being on time, perfectionism, all these different strategies that if I can do these things, my shame or grief or panic from my wounding will never surface. But we know that's not always a successful strategy. So another group of protectors, whom Dr. Schwartz labeled firefighters, are our first responders who jump in when the pain does surface. Because no matter how skilled our managerial protectors are, pain will surface if we're
Mhm.
triggered or activated,
Yeah.
and then we're swamped with it. And our firefighter protectors come in and do whatever it takes to numb the pain or to disconnect us from the pain. And as is the case, if your house is on fire, the ones who come with the hoses do not care that they are going to ruin your furniture. So our internal firefighters aren't worried about the effects of what they're doing. Their
Right.
only concern is to protect us from pain. And so that's the brief sketch of how, through the lens of IFS, we understand humans.
And it is mind blowing to me for so many reasons, Molly. One of those that just struck me as you were talking about the firefighters, as I think about the people that we serve that struggle with unwanted secret sexual behavior. And so many of them actually hate that they struggle in this way. And it's like they do what they don't want to do, like Paul talks
Right.
about.
Exactly. Romans 7:15.
That's a great IFS verse that shows
Yeah.
the fact that we have parts. We have these parts of us that do things we don't want to do. And
Hmm.
when I consider, oh, they're the parts of them that are driving the acting out
Hmm.
are these firefighters that in that moment are just trying to overcome their pain and
That's
trying to
right.
protect those exiles from feeling the depth of their vulnerability.
Hmm.
It makes so much sense. It's still like not okay.
Right.
Obviously, the work
Hmm.
has to be done, right? So that we're not living with destructive behavior.
Right.
But it gives
Right.
me so much compassion for
Hmm.
people who are
Hmm.
struggling,
Hmm.
knowing that for most of them, this is not something they want to engage in, and it is
Right.
a coping strategy.
That's right. That's right. And you've also named something that's very important to remember. We talk about the internal system, and what that also means is these parts of ourselves are connected to one another.
Hmm.
Just like when we're part of an external system, a staff group or a family system, we have roles and relationships. So you named another common dynamic internally. When we have a firefighter who adopts this strategy to survive pain, there's also almost inevitably a manager who starts trying to control that firefighter
Hmm.
internally, often
Hmm.
through criticism and shaming.
Yes.
So there's certainly people on the outside will use those strategies to try to control what they see as dysfunctional, destructive behavior because they're only focused on the effect of it, not the reason it's happening. But internally, that's going on as well. So we have a bit of an inverted triangle inside. At the top of the triangle, we have a firefighter and a manager. And at the bottom of the triangle is the same exile that
Mm,
they're both connected to. So we've got these two protectors who have different ideas of how to cope with the pain, and they're connected to one another. And often, when the manager's really loudly condemning the firefighter for their behavior, what happens in the system? The firefighter just escalates because they're pouring more fuel on well, to use that gets to be a
yeah.
mixed metaphor, but they're inflaming the
Yeah.
situation. And so one of the things we do in IFS therapy is we're working with how these parts are connected to one another, getting them into a relationship. It's really amazing when you can have these two very dedicated parts of the system get to know one another and realize, oh, we actually want the same thing.
Yeah.
We want to protect the system from pain.
And it is so mind-blowing to approach these conflictive what feels like conflictive
Oh,
parts
they are
inside
in
of us,
conflict. Yes. Mhm.
to approach them with compassion and care
Mhm.
when we have
Mhm.
access to that, or to
That's right.
receive compassion and care from somebody else who is safe when we can't access it for ourselves.
Yes. Yes.
I
You've
one
just said something important. And I highlight
What's that?
something here,
Yeah.
Kristin, which is that the access that we have to these God-given resources
Hmm.
of compassion, perspective,
Yeah.
the fruit of the spirit, gentleness,
Mhm.
kindness, all of those love attributes of love is how
Yeah.
I think of them, that those are innate. They don't have to be developed. They're God's gift to us as
Mhm.
God's image bearers, but they are constrained. And so there are times when all the other parts of the system, when our wounds and all these protective parts, all that energy that's contained in all of that blocks or constrains our access to those resources. So it's very different in IFS to think of releasing constraints versus you have to go out there and get something you don't have. You lack compassion. No, your compassion is constrained. But there
Mm.
are times when our system is so overwhelmed that we need that external safe person to bring those qualities because it's not that we don't have them, but they're buried, they're constrained. So
Yeah, I've had the image lately when I have, because even just recently, you guys, as you're listening to this, like, don't think for a minute that Molly herself or me, that we don't have parts that go bonkers when we're under
absolutely.
threat, right? This is a
Yeah,
human condition. And
exactly.
recently, under in a very stressful experience and circumstance, one of my parts was telling me like how bad I suck because I was struggling so much.
Uh-huh.
And I was able to realize like, well, yeah, because I'm dealing with all this difficulty and pain, and my
Mhm.
firefighters and protectors are all rising up to
Mhm.
try to manage the
Mhm.
situation.
Yeah.
And so this is not the kind of thing you like completely recover from, and your all of your parts are at any point in time like forever harmonious. Like this is part of the human condition,
Yes.
and anybody can
Transformation
get
is a
triggered.
lifelong process.
It
Yes.
is.
And we can hold the hope
Yeah.
of there is transformation. So as this model fundamentally is relational, the whole approach is to develop relationships between self and the various members of the internal family.
Mm.
And as we develop loving relationships, protectors who have adopted roles, whether they're managerial roles or firefighter roles, they begin to trust the leader of the system. They begin to say, well, maybe I don't have to be in charge. Maybe I don't have to react so quickly the next time the system is activated by pain. They start to trust, and there is more spaciousness, there's more partnering.
Yeah.
And of course, there is a process for healing the wounds, which again frees up protectors who can then actually sometimes retire. Say, I don't need to do that anymore because what
Yeah.
I was afraid of doesn't exist anymore. The wound's been healed. And
Mm.
then the part of the system that was burdened by pain is restored to their wonderfully unique and vital role in the system as well. So it's a process. Do I think it ends in this life? No. We're all in process of transformation in this life. But there is definite progress that can happen where people feel much freer, more
Yeah.
spacious, feel like they have more choice when things are tough.
Less reactivity,
Yes. Yes.
less,
More of an ability to respond than react.
yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, way more resourced and
Yes.
able to recover from things like shame.
Mhm. Yes. Having the capacity, knowing what do I do when I'm in a shame spiral?
Yeah.
Having practiced with a guide, we think of an IFS therapist as a guide, helping someone orient to their system, releasing more of the constraints. And then outside of the therapy session, you have the practices and skills
Hmm.
to be with those parts who are caught in that shame spiral
Yeah.
with compassion, with understanding. And that's that's powerful.
It is so powerful. One thing I want to point out, Molly, as so many of our listeners are coming from a Christian perspective,
Yeah.
is that I, for the longest time, when I have very loud inner critics, and I
Hmm.
worked a
Hmm.
12-step program for family and friends of alcoholics for many years,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
always thought of that as like my inner critic and like something I want to quiet down and silence.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
or I would look at it from this is more the Christian perspective. That is the enemy accusing me, like he is the
Yes.
accuser, right?
Right.
And I definitely still believe that the enemy is a real thing, that there, I believe in the demonic, that it is a real,
Hmm.
thing.
Hmm.
But I have stopped looking at all the perfectionistic, critical inner
Hmm.
voices in my head as constant onslaught of the enemy. And I've now
Yeah,
recognized, oh my gosh, these are my managers.
that's right. Hmm.
So
Yeah.
how does a person know when they're hearing like
Mm.
really what are some
Hmm.
of the
Hmm.
signs? This is
Yeah.
probably one of your parts. Meet your part.
Hmm. Yeah. Yes. Well, one of the things that is very surprising to people who are Christian as they learn about a secular psychotherapy model developed by a secular scientist is that along the way, Dr. Schwartz encountered energy in the system that we would call demonic. Uh, and and occasionally we encounter that in
Hmm.
people's systems. And there are a variety of reasons for that. But by and large, what we're encountering are parts of ourselves who have adopted a strategy that has, as we peel the onion and we're patiently, persistently with this part, tell me more, tell me more. They have a positive intention.
Hmm.
If it's dark energy in the system, something we would think of as demonic, there is no positive intention. But
Hmm.
it takes a skilled guide to discern that.
Yeah.
For your audience, if they begin to get curious, I would say it's very safe to assume that 99 times out of 100, this is a part of the system, even if they're nasty.
Yeah.
They feel like that's the only way they can do their job is to be nasty, to be hurtful to their host, if you will, the system they're in,
Yeah.
or someone outside of them. We think of rage, and rage is a very natural emotional response to trauma because in
Hmm.
trauma we're powerless, and rage gives us the energy to take action on our behalf, to
Mm.
fight off the person who's assaulting us. But if a child is being abused, they don't have the capacity physically to fight off the person who's harming them. So sometimes there's internalized rage that never got to be processed. That can so so there's a lot of stuff that we might associate with evil or that we realize is an unfortunate adaptation that actually helped us survive at the time. But that's where we can be with it and know, ultimately in healing the wounds, well, I don't have to keep doing that.
Yeah. The IFS term that I love to think about when it comes to approaching these parts that I may have some natural resistance to is tend and befriend.
Mhm.
Do you want to
Uh-huh.
unpack what that means a little bit? I mean, you kind of
Yeah.
just did, but I think that's an
Yeah.
easy phrase for our
Hmm.
listeners to have stuck in their heads of like thinking rather than
Hmm.
resisting and shutting up
Yeah.
these
Yeah.
parts that I don't like, how can I tend and befriend?
Yes. Well, we have to start with the resistance.
Mm.
We can't, so we start with whatever is most present. As we were talking about earlier, often these parts are in conflictual relationships with one another. We can think of it as an internal tug of war.
Yeah.
So, so we have, if we hear, let's say our intention is, well, I want to befriend my inner critic. But what you hear when you turn your attention inside and with that intention is, oh, well, she's so nasty and she's so awful. And why would you want to befriend her? Let's just get rid of her. Well, that's another part of the system. And so well, okay, all right, well, let's start here. Tell me
Mhm.
more. And so it is that's why it takes a guide when you're starting to do this work. It would be super easy if one part at a time showed up, but it's a system. And so we often hear from multiple parts. And so being with them, sometimes we can just create a sacred space and welcome whoever's there. If it feels really chaotic inside, one of the things that's very helpful is to just imagine creating a welcoming sacred space, breathing in more of the spirit, and just being with, from your heart, being with every part of your system. Just saying, you're all welcome here.
Yeah.
I might not know all of you, and you all might not know me, but love is here, and I want to get to know you. And so if that's just one of the things. So I'm not sure what you mean by tending. That's not a phrase that I use. Befriending
Okay.
is core. So awareness is perhaps what's meant by tending. So
Hmm.
it's
Hmm.
like attending
Yeah.
to noticing
Yeah.
what's there. That's the starting point.
Right.
Just shifting from what we are mostly preoccupied with, which is externals, particularly in situations where there's been betrayal. There's a lot of energy in the system about what that other person needs to do to change.
Yeah.
And that's understandable. That's a part of us that thinks that that's the route to healing. And we will be with them and befriend them. But we mostly want to make what Dr. Schwartz calls a U-turn, a YOU turn. So turning our attention back inside ourselves.
Hmm.
Who's around today? Who needs me? And then working on developing that relationship.
So powerful. So, do you think that if a person has a lot of trauma or adverse experiences as a child, that
Mhm.
they might have a lot more parts? Is that accurate?
They'll have a lot more protectors.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So yeah, because the more adversity, the more adaptation is necessary, the more strategies. And yes, so it gets busy in there. And sometimes I have clients say, how many parts of me are
Yeah.
there? When are we going to stop discovering new parts? But often they cluster into sort of teams, and they can be allied or hostile, and so so it's not as overwhelming as it might sound, because we can often get a lot done by finding out who are the big players in the system.
The
Where
ones
is
with the
that
loudest
really,
voices.
yes, and where is that really formative wounding? Sometimes there's a particular season of life when there was some pretty profound wounding. And sometimes it's what we talk about now is complex trauma, complex PTSD, where there's just adversity throughout childhood and
Mhm.
into adulthood. And sometimes, though, a protector that starts doing a particular job early in one's life, they just keep doing that job as other wounding happens. So it's not that every time a wound happens, a new protector takes a job. It's very organic and individual. So
Mm.
we can't say, well, if this happened, then you're going to have these parts.
Mhm.
That's where curiosity is such a superpower. And I think of Jesus and how often Jesus approached people with curiosity. What do you need? Do you want?
Yeah.
And when we can approach ourselves with that, I think we're really aligned with the spirit. And
Oh.
that calms the system. I suspect you've had that experience of
Mhm.
just bringing attention to a part or a segment of the system,
Yeah.
and you just feel, oh, I feel much calmer.
Absolutely. It has been mind-blowing. So we were talking about the impact of adverse experiences
Mhm.
and trauma in childhood. What is the impact? We talked about the impact on our parts. What's the impact on our nervous system when we experience ongoing stress or trauma
Mhm.
in our
Yeah.
family?
Yeah. So we can think about our nervous system as also highly adaptive. And it's as though we can imagine these protective parts of us living in our nervous system. So people might be familiar with sympathetic arousal, so
Mm-hmm.
fight or flight. So trauma happens and we have the adaptive capacity in our physiology to attempt to fight. Uh, that's the first line of defense. But often, especially earlier in life, there is no ability to fight off what's happening to us. Fleeing is the next option. And we can't always physically flee, but one of our most primitive adaptive strategies is dissociation.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have the capacity to psychologically disconnect from what's happening. And a lot of that is a primitive strategy. So people with early childhood trauma often have parts that we recognize as dissociative parts. That's their strategy. They take them out, and it helps the organism survive something horrific.
Mm-hmm.
It's very adaptive. It can be tricky if that part is very active in the system to the point where someone loses time and is so it can certainly affect functioning. But so that's fight or flight. And then if neither of those strategies work, we drop into hypoarousal. So those are associated with hyperarousal activation. If those strategies don't work, our nervous system drops into hypoarousal, and then we are disconnected, which is also part of dissociation. So that's a little confusing, but we'll keep it simple. But that is where we think of a possum playing dead, where an organism, I will never forget, we had a Newfoundland, big old dog, and we were on a walk and we saw a possum, and the possum went into hypoarousal. And that possum looked dead because she sensed a threat. Here comes this big black dog. and and we have that capacity too. So on a nervous system level. Now there's some term that some people will be familiar with that I don't think has made it into the official neuroscience, but a clinician identified another strategy we call fawning. And so people, whether the official neuroscience will adopt that as part of the nervous system strategy, I don't know. But
It's a real
it's a
thing. It
pretty
is a
common adaptive
very real
strategy,
thing.
right? Yes. And that's where we are, one of the terms we can think of that is overfunctioning,
Mhm.
where we start thinking we're gonna be safe if we do all these things for other people. So whatever we're accommodating to to the situation and doing more than is ours to do.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So, and to be sure, these strategies do not just end when we're no longer children, right? They follow us into our adult life until we are addressing them. And I know
Yeah.
I've seen in my own life um, the impact of adverse experiences in things like heightened emotional reactivity, like very easily getting triggered into like a startle response, like getting
Yes. Hmm.
easily
Hmm.
startled,
Yes.
easily going into a shame spiral.
Hmm.
There is hope though, right? I mean, there
Hmm.
is hope that
Yeah,
we can heal our nervous systems.
absolutely.
We can change our baseline from being in
Hmm.
a fight or flight state into being more
That's
of a
right.
calm state. So, Molly, as we wrap up this episode, what are some suggestions that you have for our listeners to begin this process of noticing and bringing loving energy to their parts? I mean, obviously, the ideal would be to find an internal family systems therapist. That's not always accessible to
That's right.
everybody.
That's
So,
right.
what would you recommend as just a simple next step?
I love that question. I would say begin cultivating self-awareness.
Mhm.
So, and turning as often as possible, turning one's attention inside and just noticing. And that can be noticing thoughts, doing a body scan. Is there a sensation someplace in my body? Does that sensation feel like some kind of tension? Does it feel like an impulse to do something? Just bringing curiosity, noticing, not that's the first step isn't, okay, now I know how to be with this. It's just noticing. Perhaps there are scenes that are coming up, images from a difficult conversation with someone that, and then just maybe using breath to bring in more love, more of the spirit, more and inviting that whatever one is noticing, let's be together. Let's be together in this place of love. Because that sends a message to the system. I'm not rejecting you. I'm not saying that because maybe this is an uncomfortable sensation, image, thought, that you're not welcome here. It's
Mm,
more about using the breath to say, come on, we can do this. Be with me, be with the spirit, be with love.
that is so beautiful and so practical. Thank you so much, Molly.
Oh, my
Um,
pleasure.
you guys, next episode with Molly, we're going to dive more into the internal family systems role in situations with sexual betrayal or unwanted sexual behavior. And it is going to be so good. So dial in to that in 2 weeks when that releases. If you have a moment and you haven't already, would you please rate or review the Living Truth podcast? That just helps more people to be able to find us so they can get the hope and the healing that they need. And until the next episode, I am holding out hope for you.